Three men in expensive suits had Olivia Barnes pinned against the booth at DiNapoli's family restaurant, and nobody was doing anything about it. The single father at table 6, the one with paint under his fingernails, who'd been cutting pizza for his 8-year-old daughter, set down his fork and stood up slowly. Jason Reeves wasn't looking for trouble on this Friday evening. This weekly dinner at DiNapoli's had been his tradition with Emma for 3 years now, ever since he'd moved to Oak Ridge after everything fell apart. The red vinyl booths, the smell of fresh garlic bread, and the gentle chatter of families created a cocoon of normalcy that both of them desperately needed. Emma was focused on her coloring book, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she carefully filled in a seahorse. Her dark hair was pulled back in a slightly messy ponytail that Jason had done his best with that morning. Some things you never quite master as a single dad, no matter how hard you try. "Daddy, is the pizza too hot?" Emma asked, looking up from her drawing. Her brown eyes, so much like her mother's, studied him with that perceptive gaze that sometimes caught him off guard. "No, sweetheart, just right." Jason smiled, returning to the careful task of cutting her pepperoni pizza into perfect triangles. His hands were rough and calloused, a plumber's hands that fix pipes and unclog drains by day, but still managed to be gentle enough to braid hair and bandage scraped knees. He'd positioned them at table 6 deliberately, back to the wall, clear view of both entrances. Old habits from his previous life. Emma thought it was just another of Daddy's quirks, like how he always checked the locks twice before bed, or how he could hear the slightest unusual sound in the middle of the night. "Remember what I taught you about sitting in restaurants?" Jason asked, glancing around the Friday night crowd. Emma nodded seriously. "Always know where the exits are, and watch people's hands, not their faces." She recited it like a schoolroom lesson, then immediately returned to her coloring. To her, these little safety lessons were just games they played, not the survival tactics that had kept her father alive in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. The restaurant was filled with its usual Friday crowd, families celebrating the end of the work week, couples on dates, a few lone diners enjoying plates of pasta. The waitstaff moved efficiently between tables, balancing plates and refilling drinks. Normal people living normal lives. The kind of life Jason had been trying to build for himself and Emma since hanging up his uniform. "Daddy, do you think Mom would like my seahorse?" Emma asked suddenly, holding up her coloring book. The question caught Jason off guard, as mentions of Laura often did. 3 years hadn't made her absence any easier to navigate. "She'd love it, kiddo. Blue was her favorite color." He reached across to squeeze her small hand. "And she always said you were her little artist." Emma beamed, returning to her coloring with renewed purpose. These moments when Laura's memory brought joy rather than pain were becoming more frequent, a healing that happened one small moment at a time. The bell above the door chimed, drawing Jason's attention. A young woman entered, glancing nervously around the restaurant. She was in her early 30s, professionally dressed in a well-worn blazer and pencil skirt that suggested practical rather than expensive taste. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she carried a leather messenger bag that had seen better days. What caught Jason's attention wasn't her appearance, but her behavior. She checked her phone repeatedly, glancing toward the door every few seconds. Her shoulders were tense, and when the hostess showed her to a booth, she requested one with a view of the entrance. The woman ordered coffee but didn't touch it, instead scanning the restaurant with the kind of hyper-awareness Jason recognized all too well. Someone expecting trouble, someone who knew they were being watched. "Daddy, why does that lady look scared?" Emma whispered, her crayon pausing over the seahorse's tail. Emma had her mother's intuition, that uncanny ability to read people that both blessed and cursed the women in Jason's life. "Sometimes grown-ups have worries, sweetheart," Jason said softly, cutting another piece of pizza for his daughter. "Just like how you worry about math tests, but bigger." He kept his voice calm, reassuring, but his eyes continued their systematic sweep of the restaurant. A flicker of movement caught his attention as 3 men in expensive suits walked in. They didn't bother waiting to be seated, moving with purpose toward the nervous woman's table. Everything about their body language screamed trouble. The leader was built like a linebacker, with graying temples and hands that had seen violence. His companions flanked him with practiced ease, cutting off the woman's escape routes. Jason felt his muscles tense. his breathing automatically shifting to the controlled rhythm he'd learned during training. "Miss Barnes," the leader said, his voice carrying a quiet menace that made other conversations falter. "You've been avoiding our calls." The woman's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down, her face pale but defiant. "I told you people I'm not interested," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Find another lawyer." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He slid into the booth across from her uninvited, while his companions remained standing, blocking her in. Jason's grip tightened on his fork, every instinct screaming at him to move. But Emma was right there, and he'd sworn never to let violence touch her world again. "See, that's where you're wrong, counselor," the man continued, his tone conversational but loaded with threat. "You don't get to walk away from Maxwell Grant. Not when you know what you know." He leaned forward, and the woman instinctively pressed back against the booth. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to withdraw from the Reynolds case. You're going to forget everything you think you discovered, and you're going to go back to handling divorce cases and parking tickets like a good little lawyer." The ceramic plate hit the wall inches from the woman's face before anyone could react, white fragments scattering across the red vinyl seat. One of the men had swept it off the table in a casual display of violence, and now all three were leaning over her, their voices dropping to harsh whispers that carried more menace than shouts ever could. Other patrons were starting to leave, sensing the danger but unwilling to get involved. The waitress had disappeared behind the counter, probably calling the police, but Jason knew they wouldn't arrive in time. "Daddy," Emma's voice was small, confused, her crayon frozen over the coloring book. "That lady is scared, like when I have nightmares and you come to make the monsters go away." Jason looked at his daughter's wide eyes, saw the concern creeping in, and something inside him clicked into place. He'd retired from the teams to give Emma a normal life, to protect her from the darkness he'd lived in for 8 years. But sometimes protecting innocence meant embracing violence one more time. "Stay here and keep coloring, Emma," he said quietly. "Daddy needs to help someone." Emma nodded solemnly, understanding in her eyes beyond her years. "Be careful, Daddy." Jason stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet restaurant. The men at the woman's table hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on intimidating their target, but the woman's eyes found his across the room. She saw something there that made her breath catch. Not the mild-mannered plumber who always said please and thank you, but something harder, more dangerous, something that had been sleeping for 3 years and was now fully awake. "Excuse me," Jason said, his voice carrying clearly across the restaurant. The 3 men turned toward him, and their leader's expression shifted from annoyance to calculation as he took in Jason's work clothes, his paint-stained hands, his utterly ordinary appearance. "Mind your own business, pal," the leader said dismissively. "This is a private conversation." But something in Jason's stillness, in the way he held himself, made the man's companions shift nervously. They were hired muscle, probably ex-military themselves, and they recognized something in Jason's bearing that civilian eyes missed. "I am minding my business," Jason replied, taking a step closer. "My business is making sure my daughter can finish her dinner in peace. Your business seems to be scaring people. I think we have a conflict of interest." His voice remained calm, conversational, but there was steel underneath that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. The leader stood up, all 6'4" of him, probably expecting the slight plumber to back down. Instead, Jason moved with fluid precision, closing the distance between them in 3 steps. What happened next took exactly 15 seconds, but it unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of controlled violence. Jason's hand shot out, grabbed the leader's wrist, and twisted with surgical precision. The crack of bone echoed through the restaurant as the man's arm bent at an impossible angle. Before the leader hit the ground, Jason had already moved to the second man, using his momentum to drive an elbow into the man's solar plexus. The attacker folded like a house of cards, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The third man reached for something inside his jacket, but Jason was already there, his hand clamping down on the man's wrist with enough force to make him drop whatever he'd been reaching for. A gentle push sent him stumbling backward into an empty table, hands raised in surrender. The entire restaurant fell silent, except for the groaning of the 2 men on the floor and the soft scratch of Emma's crayon against paper. Jason straightened his work shirt and walked back to his table as if nothing had happened. But his eyes never left the three men. The leader was struggling to his feet, cradling his broken wrist, his face a mask of pain and rage. "This isn't over," he snarled. But Jason just looked at him with the kind of cold patience that spoke of deeper violence held in check. "Yes, it is," Jason said simply. "You're going to leave now. You're going to forget about Miss Barnes. And if I see you or anyone like you bothering innocent people in my town again, we'll have another conversation. Trust me, you won't enjoy that one as much as I will." The quiet authority in his voice made the leader take an involuntary step backward. The three men limped toward the exit, the leader pausing only to glare back at Jason with the kind of hatred that promised future violence. But Jason had seen that look before in a dozen different countries, from 100 different enemies. It didn't scare him anymore. What scared him was the way Emma was looking at him now, her coloring book forgotten, her young mind trying to process what she'd just witnessed. "My daddy was in the Navy," Emma announced to the room, her voice matter-of-fact in the way only children could manage. "He protected people from bad guys, like on TV, but real." She went back to coloring her seahorse as if her father dismantling three armed men was just another Friday night occurrence. Olivia Barnes sat in her booth, staring at Jason with an expression that mixed gratitude, confusion, and something that might have been recognition. Her hands were no longer shaking, but her mind was racing, trying to reconcile the quiet man who ordered extra napkins for his daughter with the precision instrument of violence she just witnessed. "Thank you," she called out softly. But Jason was already back at his table, cutting pizza for Emma as if the last 2 minutes had never happened. Other patrons were slowly returning to their conversations. The immediate danger passed, but an undercurrent of tension